Passions of the gods have ignited wars and defined our world. We are about to journey through 25 myths of divine love and war, stories where heartbreak and battle are woven from the same cosmic thread. By the end, you will see the ancient blueprint behind our deepest human stories, the timeless patterns of conflict and desire. We will question if a goddess grief truly created winter and how a single golden apple could burn a city to the ground. What do you believe is the most powerful force in the universe, love or war? Our very first myth is not set on a battlefield, but in a sunlit meadow. Here, the story of Persephone begins, a tale where love and loss are written into the turning of the earth itself. Persephone was the radiant daughter of Demeter, the goddess who made the crops grow and the fields flourish. One day, as she gathered flowers, the ground beneath her feet split open. From the darkness emerged Hades, the stern and lonely ruler of the underworld. Struck by her light, he swept Persephone into his chariot and carried her down to his shadowy kingdom to be his queen. This was not a courtship, it was an abduction, a sudden rupture in the natural order. Above, Demeter's world shattered. Consumed by a grief so profound it froze the very heart of the earth, she abandoned her duties. She wandered the land disguised as an old woman while the soil turned hard and cold. Flowers withered, trees became skeletons, and the first endless winter descended upon the world. This was not a meteorological event to the ancient Greeks. It was the direct consequence of a mother's divine despair, a literal and chilling manifestation of love denied. Eventually, a compromise was brokered. Because Persephone had eaten a few seeds of a pomegranate in the underworld, she was bound to return there for part of each year. So, for 1/3 of the year, she reigns as queen of the dead beside Hades. During these months, Demeter mourns, and the world above lies fallow and cold. This is our autumn and winter, but when Persephone ascends back to the surface, her mother's joy makes the earth burst forth with life once more. This is the return of spring and the abundance of summer. Look beyond the surface of this beautiful explanation for the seasons. This myth is a masterclass in blending profound themes. It speaks of a mother's possessive, world-altering love. It presents a stark power dynamic between gods where desire leads to taking, not asking. And at its core, it offers a powerful metaphor for the cycle of life, death, and rebirth that governs all things. The seed must fall into the dark earth to later sprout. The year must have its barren period to appreciate its bounty. Persephone's journey is the world's journey, a story where divine emotion becomes the engine of our reality. From the quiet cycle of seasons born of grief, we plunge into a myth of raw scandal and public spectacle. If Persephone's story is about love causing cosmic change, the tale of Ares and Aphrodite shows love as a weapon of personal chaos. Here, the god of war and the goddess of love, two forces that should be opposites, became passionate allies in secret. Ares embodied the brutal, chaotic frenzy of battle. Aphrodite represented beauty, desire, and seduction. Their union was a volatile fusion, a symbol that love itself could be a kind of warfare, and that conflict could be driven by fierce passion. This was not a hidden, sorrowful love, but a brazen affair conducted right under the nose of Aphrodite's husband, the brilliant but physically imperfect smith god Hephaestus. Hephaestus, often mocked for his limp, was no fool. He learned of the betrayal and crafted a plan not of violence but of exquisite humiliation. In his divine forge, he wove a net of threads so fine they were nearly invisible, yet stronger than any chain. He placed this net over the bed he shared with Aphrodite and then pretended to leave for his workshop. When Ares and Aphrodite next met there, the trap was sprung. The unbreakable net fell, ensnaring the lovers completely, frozen in their intimate moment. Hephaestus then called all the other Olympian gods to witness his catch. Imagine the scene, the laughter and pointed remarks as the most powerful deities gathered to gawk at the trapped god of war and goddess of love, utterly vulnerable and exposed. This was the ultimate punishment in a society that valued honor and public reputation, a ridicule that cut deeper than any sword. The myth delivers a sharp commentary on more than just adultery. It reveals the gods' own very human flaws, their capacity for pettiness, jealousy, and schadenfreude. Even the mighty are not above social laws and the consequences of betrayal. But the story's deepest truth lies in the children this union produced. From Ares and Aphrodite came Phobos and Deimos, whose names mean fear and terror. These were not minor spirits, but personifications of the very emotions that grip a soldier's heart on the battlefield. Think about that profound connection. The offspring of love and war are not beauty or strength, but panic and dread. The Greeks saw a direct familial link between the passion of desire and the chaos of conflict, suggesting that both spring from the same uncontrollable, primal part of existence. One could ignite the other in a heartbeat. While the gods laughed at the exposed lovers, a far more dangerous contest of vanity was already brewing, one that would set an entire civilization ablaze. Our third myth begins not with a battle cry, but with an invitation to a wedding. The sea nymph Thetis was marrying a mortal king, and all the gods were invited except for one, Eris, the goddess of strife and discord. Furious at the slight, she crafted her revenge not with a weapon but with a single piece of fruit. She threw a golden apple into the wedding feast, inscribed with the words "for the fairest." Instantly, three goddesses laid claim to it: Hera, the queen of the gods; Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare; and Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. None of the other gods dared to judge between such powerful figures, so the task fell to a mortal, a young Trojan prince named Paris, who was tending his flocks on a mountainside, believed to be the most impartial man alive. The goddesses appeared before him not as humble petitioners but as deal-makers. Each offered a bribe to sway his judgment. Hera promised him boundless political power and kingship over all the lands of Asia. Athena offered unmatched wisdom and skill in war, guaranteeing he would become the greatest warrior who ever lived. Finally, Aphrodite stepped forward. She did not offer conquest or glory on the battlefield. She simply loosened the sash of her robe and promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, a shepherd at heart, not a king or a general, handed the golden apple to Aphrodite. In that single moment, he made a choice that was profoundly, devastatingly human. He chose personal desire over empire or invincibility. He chose the promise of a love story, but in the world of the gods, a mortal's choice is never just his own. To fulfill her promise, Aphrodite guided Paris to Sparta, where he was a guest in the palace of King Menelaus. There he met the king's wife, Helen, whose face was said to have launched 1,000 ships. With Aphrodite's power clouding her mind, Helen agreed to flee with Paris back to Troy. This was not a simple elopement, it was a catastrophic violation of the sacred bond between guest and host, an act that Menelaus and his powerful brother Agamemnon could not ignore. They called upon every oath-bound king and hero of Greece to honor their pledge to defend Helen's marriage. A vast fleet assembled, and the Greeks sailed for Troy, beginning a war that would last 10 grueling years, consume countless heroes, and ultimately result in the utter destruction of a great city. All of it over a single golden apple and a mortal man's decision. This myth forces us to ask a haunting question: where does human agency end and divine manipulation begin? Was Paris a fool seduced by a goddess, or was he merely a pawn in a celestial squabble? The gods used humanity as their chessboard, their vanity and rivalries playing out through human pain on a colossal scale. The Trojan War, the foundational conflict of Greek legend, begins not with a strategic dispute, but with a beauty contest judged by a lovesick shepherd. It suggests that the greatest wars are sometimes born not from calculated hatred, but from tangled threads of vanity, broken promises, and the irresistible, often destructive pull of desire. The golden apple had set the stage, but the war it ignited would be defined by a single man's rage. For all the gods' manipulations, the Trojan War's most pivotal force was a very human emotion, the all-consuming wrath of Achilles. This myth peels back the layers of epic battle to reveal a story about honor, love, and the catastrophic cost of pride. It begins not with Achilles, but with another act of divine offense. The Greek king Agamemnon, leader of the expedition, had taken a woman named Chryseis as his war prize. Her father was a priest of Apollo, and he begged for her return, offering a rich ransom. When Agamemnon arrogantly refused, the priest prayed to his god. Apollo, the archer god, heard his plea and descended upon the Greek camp like a terrible darkness. He rained down arrows of plague, and for 9 days men and animals died in agony. This was the direct, terrifying consequence of insulting a god, a reminder that even the greatest army was subject to divine will. To stop the plague, Agamemnon was forced to return Chryseis, but in a move that would unravel everything, he demanded compensation for his loss. He declared he would take the war prize of another, Achilles, the Greeks' greatest warrior. That prize was a woman named Chryseis. To modern ears, this sounds like a property dispute, but in the heroic code of that age, a warrior's prize was the tangible measure of his honor, his time, and his glory. Taking Chryseis was not just an insult, it was a public stripping of Achilles' worth, a declaration that his immense contributions meant nothing. And here, the myth introduces a profound complexity. Ancient sources strongly suggest Achilles loved Chryseis, not merely as a trophy, but as a person. His rage, his menace, was therefore a volatile cocktail of wounded pride and genuine heartbreak. So Achilles made a decision that would doom his allies. He withdrew. He took his personal troops, the Myrmidons, and he sat by his ships, refusing to fight. He prayed to his mother, the sea goddess Thetis, to turn the tide of war against the Greeks so they would feel the desperate cost of his absence, and they did. Without their champion, the Greeks were pushed back to the very edge of their camp, suffering terrible losses. The war became a stalemate of suffering, all because one man's love and honor were violated. Yet within Achilles' isolation grew another love, one that would ultimately prove more powerful than his rage. His deepest bond was with his companion, Patroclus. The nature of their relationship has been debated for millennia, but the text is clear. Their love was profound, the central relationship of Achilles' life. Watching his Greek comrades die, Patroclus could bear it no longer. He begged Achilles to let him enter the fray, to wear the famous armor so the Trojans would think Achilles had returned and lose heart. Achilles agreed, but with one stern warning: do not pursue the enemy back to Troy, just save the ships. Patroclus fought with the fury of Achilles, driving the Trojans back. But in the heat of victory, he forgot the warning. He chased the retreating army to the very walls of Troy, where he faced the Trojan champion, Hector. And there, with Apollo's help, Hector struck Patroclus down. The news shattered Achilles, his rage, once cold and strategic, now transformed into a grief so violent it shook the heavens. He roared with a sound that terrified the army, and his mother, Thetis, heard his agony from the depths of the sea. This was no longer about Chryseis or wounded pride. This was about avenging the man he loved. Forged new armor by the god Hephaestus, Achilles returned to battle with a fury so complete it bordered on madness. He slaughtered Trojans without mercy, so many that the river god himself rose up to fight him. He sought only one man, Hector. Their duel was brief and brutal. Achilles killed the Trojan prince, and in a final, shocking act of desecration born from unbearable grief, he tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it through the dust around the walls of Troy. In this one myth, we see the full spectrum of divine love and war. Apollo's love for his priest triggers the plague. Achilles' love for Briseis and overwhelmingly for Patroclus directly dictates the flow of a 10-year war. His wrath is a personal tempest that creates a strategic disaster, and his grief unleashes a violence that transcends the rules of battle. The gods set the pieces in motion, but it is human heartbreak in all its messy, passionate intensity that truly writes the story of the bloodshed. Achilles chose a short, glorious life knowing it would end at Troy, but he could never have known the price would be paid by the one he loved most. Achilles' rage defined the battlefield, but the true cost of the Trojan War was measured in the decades of waiting that followed. For every hero who fell at Troy, there was a home left in limbo, a story of love tested by the sheer, grinding passage of time. This brings us to our fifth myth, the profound romance of Odysseus and Penelope, a tale where love itself becomes a form of warfare, fought not with spears but with wit and unwavering loyalty. While the Iliad sings of wrath, the Odyssey is an epic of homecoming, a 20-year testament to a bond that refused to break. Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, spent 10 years fighting at Troy and another 10 years lost, battling monsters and gods on his desperate voyage home. His wife, Penelope, believed him alive against all odds while facing a siege of a different kind. Their palace was overrun by over 100 suitors, arrogant men from neighboring islands who devoured the kingdom's wealth and insisted Odysseus was dead. They demanded Penelope choose a new husband. Her position was impossibly fragile, a woman alone in a world that saw her as a prize, so she fought a war of deception. She announced she would choose a husband only after she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father, Laertes. Each day she would work diligently at her loom. And each night by candlelight she would secretly unravel everything she had woven that day. This brilliant, desperate ruse bought her 3 precious years. Think of the mental fortitude that required, the daily performance of hope while secretly undoing her own visible progress, all to preserve a faith that might have been in vain. Penelope was not a passive figure pining by the window. She was a strategist equal to her husband, using the only weapons available to her, patience, craft, and words, to hold her home and her heart intact. Their relationship is the quiet cornerstone of the entire epic. It represents an ideal rarely celebrated in myths of this scale, a partnership based not just on passion, but on mutual respect and intellectual kinship. Odysseus was known as the man of many turns, the great trickster. Penelope, in her own palace, proved to be his perfect match. When a ragged beggar finally appears in her court claiming to have news of Odysseus, she devises a test only her true husband could pass. She orders a servant to move the massive, immovable marriage bed from their chamber. Odysseus, exhausted and in disguise, instantly flares with anger. He reveals the bed's secret, that he built it himself around the living trunk of a great olive tree, making it impossible to move without destroying it. This is the emotional climax of their 20-year separation. The bed is not just a piece of furniture, it is a symbol of their union, rooted in the very land of Ithaca, grown from something natural and permanent. It was untouched by the chaos of war and the corruption in their own home. In that moment, all disguises fall away. Their reunion is built on a private truth, a shared memory of creation and stability. This myth offers a powerful counterpoint to the violent passions we have seen. Here, love is not a sudden abduction or an affair that sparks a war. It is a slow, stubborn act of preservation. It is the choice to weave and unweave, to outsmart and to wait. The love of Odysseus and Penelope is the quiet engine that drives the hero's entire journey home. It suggests that the greatest victory after a war might not be in the battle itself, but in the delicate, difficult work of picking up the threads of a life interrupted and weaving them back together, stronger than before. Penelope's patient weaving held a home together, but some loves are so fierce they refuse to accept the finality of death itself. This is the tragedy of Orpheus and Eurydice, a story that tests the very limits of devotion. Orpheus was no warrior king. His power lay in his music. He was the greatest musician who ever lived, a poet whose lyre could charm wild beasts, make trees uproot themselves to follow him, and calm the roughest seas. His art was a kind of magic, a direct line to the soul of the world, and his soul belonged entirely to Eurydice, a nymph of the forests. Their love was immediate and total, a perfect harmony. But on their wedding day, as she danced in a sun-dappled meadow, Eurydice stepped on a hidden viper. Its bite was swift and fatal. In an instant, the music of their life together was silenced. Orpheus' grief was a sound more terrible than any silence. He could not accept it, so he did what no living mortal had ever dared. He decided to go down and bring her back. Armed only with his lyre, he walked the path to the underworld, past the ghostly shades, to stand before the throne of Hades and Persephone. There, in that sunless hall, he did not plead or threaten. He played, he poured all his love and loss into a song so beautiful, so unbearably full of human longing, that it stopped the endless punishments of the damned. Sisyphus paused on his hill, Tantalus forgot his thirst, the Furies, those ancient spirits of vengeance, wept tears of black iron. Even the stern heart of Hades, the unseen one, was moved. Persephone, who knew the price of a life divided between light and dark, understood his pain most of all. Moved by the art that had touched her own memories of sunlight, Hades offered a deal, a thread of impossible hope. Orpheus could lead Eurydice back to the world of the living. She would follow behind him through the dark passages, but there was one condition, absolute and non-negotiable. He must not turn around to look at her, not once, not a glance. He must trust she was there until they both stood fully in the light of the upper world. Think of that walk, the slow, agonizing climb out of darkness, with the only sound the echo of their footsteps. Orpheus had his proof, the gods themselves had decreed it. Yet with every step a terrible doubt began to gnaw. Was her footfall really there? Was it just an echo of his own hope? Had the Lord of the Dead tricked him? The silence behind him became a void, a question mark more terrifying than any monster he had passed. The weight of his love became a crushing fear of losing her all over again. As the first grey hint of daylight finally filtered into the tunnel mouth, as he felt the living air on his face, his faith shattered. He had to know. He had to see her. He turned, and there she was, not a ghost but his Eurydice, solid and real and so close. Their eyes met for one fleeting, eternal second. And in that moment the condition was broken, the deal unraveled. He saw the light fade from her eyes, not with anger but with a sorrow as deep as his own. She did not cry out, she simply whispered a single farewell and was drawn back into the shadows, this time forever. His hand grasped only at empty air. He had reached the light, but he had looked back into the darkness, and the darkness had reclaimed its prize. This myth is a masterclass in heartbreaking paradox. It is about a love so powerful it moved the gods of death, yet was undone by that very same love's inseparable twin, human doubt. Orpheus did not fail from lack of love, but from an excess of it, a need for reassurance that the miracle was real. His glance was not carelessness, it was the most human of frailties. The story asks us, could anyone have walked that path without looking? It suggests that perfect love requires perfect faith, a condition perhaps too heavy for any mortal heart to bear. And in the end, it is Orpheus' art, not his heroism, that becomes the true power. His music achieved the impossible, it bent the rules of the universe. But no song, no matter how beautiful, could ultimately rewrite the final law of loss or shield the human heart from its own fragile, questioning nature. He won her back with his art and lost her with his humanity. Orpheus's music could not conquer death, but in another tradition, a different kind of devotion achieved the impossible. In the vast tapestry of Hindu mythology, we find a cosmic love story that is not about winning back a lost soul, but about awakening one. This is the myth of Shiva and Parvati, a union that balances the very pillars of existence. Shiva is the supreme ascetic, the lord of destruction and transformation, who sits in deep meditation atop a frozen mountain, detached from the entire world. His power is immense, but it is turned inward, a force of potential waiting to be engaged. Parvati is the daughter of the Mountain King, an incarnation of the divine feminine, embodying devotion, nurturing power, and unwavering resolve. She loves Shiva, but he, absorbed in his eternal silence, does not even notice her. Parvati's quest is not one of persuasion or trickery. It is a journey of absolute transformative dedication. To match Shiva's own spiritual intensity, she must become his equal in discipline. She retreats into the forest to perform tapasya, profound austerities. She renounces all comfort, standing on one foot for years, meditating through scorching summers and monsoons, eating only leaves and focusing her entire being on her goal. Her tapasya generates a spiritual heat so immense it begins to shake the heavens. The gods themselves grow alarmed by the power of her concentration. Her devotion is not a passive longing, it is an active, world-altering force. It is through this fierce, self-generated power that she finally captures Shiva's attention. He opens his eyes and for the first time truly sees her. Her love, proven through unparalleled discipline, melts the heart of the ultimate ascetic. They marry in a celestial union that brings the universe into a new harmony. Their marriage represents the essential balance of all opposites. Shiva, the destroyer, is joined with Parvati, the mother and creator. The solitary yogi embraces the householder's life. This myth teaches that neither extreme is complete alone. Absolute detachment without connection and love leaves the world cold. Unchecked creation without the cleansing force of destruction leads to stagnation. Together, they are the dynamic cycle of the cosmos itself. This balance is made manifest in their children. Their son Kartikeya, the god of war, is born from a spark of Shiva's fiery energy for a specific purpose, to lead the celestial armies and defeat a demon that threatened the worlds. Here, the power born of divine love is channeled directly into a necessary, righteous war. Their other son, Ganesha, the elephant-headed god, has a birth story rooted in a mother's protective love. Parvati creates him from clay to guard her door, and when Shiva unknowingly beheads him, he restores the boy's life with the head of an elephant, making him the revered remover of obstacles. Ganesha's very form symbolizes the transformative, sometimes surprising, outcomes of this divine partnership. The love of Shiva and Parvati shows us that the most formidable forces can be engaged not by confrontation but by resonant dedication. Parvati did not break Shiva's meditation with a plea. She joined him in its depth through her own will. Their story tells us that devotion, when it is as disciplined and fierce as any ascetic's practice, can bridge any divide, even the one between creation and destruction. It is a love that does not just warm a single heart, but brings the entire universe into a state of fruitful, dynamic equilibrium. The serene balance of Shiva and Parvati stands in stark contrast to the epic storm of the Mahabharata. This is not a single myth, but a universe of stories, a war so vast it feels like the world's entire store of conflict poured onto one field. At its heart is a family, the Kuru dynasty, tearing itself apart. On one side, the 5 Pandava brothers, virtuous and skilled. On the other, their 100 cousins, the Kauravas, led by the envious Duryodhana. Their rivalry begins not with armies, but with a childhood game, a game of dice that is rigged. The Pandavas lose everything, their kingdom, their wealth, even their shared wife, Draupadi. They are forced into 13 years of exile. This is where love curdles into something darker. The bond of cousins becomes a web of humiliation, pride, and a refusal to forgive. When the Pandavas return to claim their rightful share, Duryodhana will not yield a single inch of land. He has been poisoned by his own envy, a jealousy so consuming it blinds him to reason. And so the greatest armies in the world gather at the field of Kurukshetra. Uncles will fight nephews, students will face their teachers, and brothers will raise weapons against brothers. It is a civil war in the most intimate, devastating sense. Yet, hovering above this human tragedy is a divine blueprint. The gods have willed this conflict. It is a dharma yudha, a righteous war, necessary to cleanse the world of a rising tide of adharma, of cosmic disorder and evil. The Kauravas, with their greed and deceit, represent that corruption. The war, therefore, is not a mere political struggle. It is a surgical strike by the universe itself to restore balance. And the instrument of this divine will is not a thunderbolt but a charioteer. As the two armies face each other, the air thick with the tension of impending slaughter, the Pandava prince Arjuna asks his friend and cousin, the god Krishna, to drive his chariot into the no-man's land between the forces. There, Arjuna looks across and sees the faces of his loved ones, his grandfathers, his teachers, his friends. His warrior spirit collapses. How can he fight a war that will destroy his own family? He lays down his bow and declares he will not fight. In this moment of supreme human crisis, on the very brink of battle, Krishna delivers the Bhagavad Gita. This is not a sermon given in a temple, but a spiritual discourse shouted over the rumble of chariot wheels. Krishna reveals his cosmic form, showing Arjuna that the soul is eternal, that he is not killing anyone, but merely fulfilling his sacred duty as a warrior. He speaks of detachment, of acting according to one's dharma without being attached to the fruits of the action. He tells Arjuna to fight, not out of hatred or desire for victory, but because it is his righteous duty to stand against evil. The love here is terrifying in its scale. It is a divine love for cosmic order that demands a horrific human price. Krishna loves Arjuna enough to guide him, but he also loves the universe enough to orchestrate a war that will kill millions, including those he himself cares for. The Mahabharata forces us to sit with this impossible paradox. Can a war ever be truly righteous? Is any cause worth the blood of your own kin? The epic provides no easy answers, only the haunting image of a grieving warrior, guided by a god, doing his duty in a world where love and destruction are two sides of the same cosmic coin. From the cosmic battlefield of Kurukshetra, we journey to the banks of the Nile, to a story where love becomes an act of sacred archaeology. This is the myth of Isis and Osiris, a cornerstone of Egyptian belief that binds together devotion, magic, and an inevitable war for justice. Osiris was the wise and benevolent god-king who brought civilization to Egypt, teaching its people agriculture and law. His reign was a golden age of order known as Mut. But his brother Set, the god of chaos, storms, and the desert, burned with a jealousy as hot as the barren sands he represented. Set did not merely want the throne, he wanted to erase Osiris from existence. In an act of brutal treachery, Set crafted a beautiful, ornate chest perfectly fitted to his brother's measurements. At a grand feast, he offered it as a gift to whoever fit inside. When Osiris, unsuspecting, lay down in the chest, Set and his conspirators slammed the lid shut, sealed it with molten lead, and hurled it into the Nile. The god-king was dead, his body lost to the river's currents. This was more than murder, it was an assault on cosmic order itself. The world plunged into chaos without its rightful ruler. But Osiris had a counterpart, his sister wife Isis, the goddess of magic, healing, and fierce protective power. Her grief did not paralyze her, it ignited a quest. Isis searched the length of the Nile, using her deep knowledge of spells and secrets. She finally found the chest lodged in a tamarisk tree in a far-off land, which had grown around it, enclosing her husband in its trunk. She recovered his body and brought it back to the hidden marshes of the Nile Delta to perform the rites that would restore him, yet Set discovered her sanctuary. In a second, even more horrific act of desecration, he dismembered Osiris's body, scattering the 14 pieces across the entire land of Egypt. A lesser love would have shattered then. Isis's did not. With her sister Nephthys, she transformed into a kite, a bird of prey, and soared over the country. piece by sacred piece, she recovered her husband's remains. Where she found each part, a temple was later built, but one piece, his phallus, was consumed by a Nile fish and lost forever. Undeterred, Isis used her profound magic, weaving together spells of protection and animation with gold and resin. She reassembled Osiris, creating the first mummy, and with her wings she fanned the breath of life back into him just long enough to conceive their son, the sky god Horus. This temporary resurrection was not a failure, it was a triumph of will over fate. Osiris would not return to rule the living world, but descended to become the merciful lord of the dead, the judge of souls in the afterlife. His resurrection was eternal, but it was otherworldly. The duty of restoring Mot to the land of the living now fell to the child born of this miraculous union. Horus was raised in the hidden marshes, protected by his mother's magic from Set's relentless hunts. Isis was the archetype of the devoted wife and mother, but her devotion was not passive. It was strategic, patient, and immensely powerful. She schooled Horus in his destiny to avenge his father and reclaim the throne of Egypt. When Horus came of age, he challenged Set before a tribunal of the gods. What followed was an 80-year divine war, a conflict fought with magic, trickery, and brute force. Horus lost an eye in the battle, which was later restored by the god Thoth, becoming the sacred Wedjat eye, a symbol of protection and wholeness. Set was castrated, symbolizing the cutting off of his chaotic, sterile power. The gods finally decreed Horus the rightful king of the living world, while Set was confined to the outer deserts, a necessary but contained force of chaos. The myth lays out a profound sequence, a love that defied death, that reassembled a god from fragments, directly created the champion who would wage the war to set the world right again. Isis's magic was the precondition for Horus's vengeance. This story frames war not as a product of petty jealousy like Set's, but as a necessary, cosmic consequence of a restorative love. The conflict between Horus and Set was the universe's method of rebalancing the scales, of ensuring that a love powerful enough to conquer death would also see justice done in the land of the living. The reassembled body of Osiris brought order to the afterlife, but what happens when a god decides the living world deserves only chaos? In the pantheon of Egypt, no deity embodies the terrifying pivot from love to war more starkly than the lioness goddess Sekhmet. Her story is not one of jealousy or betrayal, but of a father's calculated wrath and a daughter's uncontrollable fury. The sun god Ra, the creator himself, had grown old. He watched from his celestial bark as humanity, the very beings he had fashioned, began to mock him, to plot against him, and to disregard the laws of Mot. Their ingratitude festered into outright rebellion. In his anger, Ra did not send a plague or a drought. He reached into his own divine essence and unleashed his daughter, Sekhmet, the powerful one. She was not merely a weapon, she was a manifestation of his own righteous, searing anger given physical form, a lion-headed goddess whose breath was the hot desert wind and whose roar could shake the foundations of the mountains. Her descent was an apocalypse. Sekhmet did not wage war, she became a force of nature. She stalked the land with a single, glorious purpose: to slaughter. Her claws tore through villages, her jaws snapped bones, and the earth grew slick with blood. She was the embodiment of Ra's punitive will, but something shifted in the ecstasy of the carnage. The mission blurred. Sekhmet developed a taste for the destruction itself. The red mist of battle intoxicated her, and her rage, once a directed punishment, became an all-consuming addiction. She was no longer merely executing her father's judgment. She was reveling in the hunt, and she would not stop until every last human was a broken corpse at her feet. Ra watched from above, and a cold dread replaced his anger. His tool of correction was now a runaway engine of extinction. He had unleashed a power that could undo creation itself, wiping out the very species he had made. This presented a profound theological problem. How do you stop a goddess who is, by her very nature, unstoppable? Force was impossible. pleading would be useless against her bloodlust. The solution had to be a trick, a divine sleight of hand that worked with her nature, not against it. The plan was born from cunning and a deep understanding of the enemy. Ra commanded his priests to grind thousands of red ochre stones into powder. They took vast quantities of beer, the common drink of Egypt, and mixed in the ochre until it resembled a thick, crimson lake of blood. Under the cover of night, they poured this dyed beer across the fields where Sekhmet was due to hunt at dawn. As the first light broke, the lioness goddess prowled into the area, her senses primed for the scent of fear and copper. Instead, she found the land seemingly flooded with blood. Believing it to be the remnants of her previous day's work, she roared with delight. She bent her head and began to lap at the liquid, drinking deeply. The beer was soporific, heavy and potent. She drank and drank, thinking she was consuming the life force of her enemies. The intoxication of slaughter was replaced by a literal, physical intoxication. Her movements slowed, her roars softened to murmurs, and finally, the great and terrible Sekhmet laid down in the field and fell into a deep, profound sleep. When she awoke, the fire in her heart had been quenched, the bloodlust was gone. The goddess who rose was no longer Sekhmet the destroyer, but Hathor, the goddess of love, music, dance, and motherhood. Her face was now serene, often depicted as a woman with the gentle ears of a cow, a symbol of nurturing and protective love. This was not a replacement, but a transformation. The Egyptians understood these two aspects as inseparable sides of the same divine power. Sekhmet was the scorching, protective rage that could burn away disease and enemies. Hathor was the joyful, life-affirming love that fostered community and art. One could become the other in an instant. The myth explains the necessity of both, the dangerous line between them, and the vital role of wisdom in guiding that transition. Ra's love for his creation, however frustrated, ultimately demanded he stop his own wrath incarnate. He saved humanity not with a greater violence, but with a clever, almost playful deception that appealed to the very frenzy he sought to end. It asks us to consider the nature of righteous anger. When does protective force tip over into mindless brutality? And what, in our own lives, is the dyed beer, the clever intervention that can calm the inner Sekhmet before she destroys everything we claim to be protecting? The transformation of Sekhmet into Hathor reveals a divine duality, but in the fertile crescent of ancient Sumer, the connection between a goddess's heart and the world's harvest was even more direct and perilous. This is the myth of Inanna and Dumuzid, a story so vital it was reenacted by kings to ensure the very survival of their civilization. Inanna, the queen of heaven, was a force of life itself, goddess of love, fertility, and political power. Her consort was Dumuzid, the shepherd god, who embodied the fertile, pastoral wealth of the land. Their union was not just a romance, it was the sacred marriage that guaranteed the earth's bounty. A ritual so crucial it was performed annually by the ruler and a priestess to secure prosperity for the coming year. But this story takes a dark and unexpected turn, one that begins not with an abduction but with a conscious, dangerous choice. Inanna, in her insatiable quest for power, decided to descend into the Kur, the Sumerian underworld, to attend the funeral of her sister Ereshkigal's husband. She knew it was a realm from which no one returns. Determined, she instructed her loyal servant Ninshubur to raise a lament and seek help from the great gods if she did not come back. Then Inanna adorned herself with 7 divine symbols of her power, her crown, her lapis lazuli necklace, her royal robe, and more, each representing an aspect of her authority. She approached the 7 gates of the underworld like a queen arriving in a foreign land. But Ereshkigal, the grim ruler of that sunless place, saw this as an invasion, a threat to her absolute dominion. At each gate, the gatekeeper, following Ereshkigal's orders, stripped Inanna of one of her sacred items. By the time she stood naked before her sister's throne, she was no longer the queen of heaven, but a vulnerable supplicant. The 7 judges of the underworld fixed their gaze upon her, and Ereshkigal unleashed her wrath. Inanna was killed, and her corpse was hung on a hook like a piece of meat. The moment her life force left the upper world, a terrible stillness fell. With the goddess of love and fertility gone, all procreation ceased on earth. Animals would not mate, plants would not bear fruit, and human couples felt no desire. The world was frozen in a state of sterile grief, a living death. This was the ultimate consequence, a total systems failure of life itself triggered by a goddess's ambition. Above, Ninchuba waited, then acted. She raised the lament as instructed, pleading with the gods Enlil and Nanna, but they refused to interfere, claiming Inanna had chosen her fate. Finally, she went to Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water. Enki, from the dirt beneath his fingernails, created 2 sexless beings, the Gala Tura and the Ker Jara. He gave them the food and water of life and sent them into the underworld. They found Ereshkigal moaning in the pain of childbirth, a pain they empathized with, offering comfort. Grateful for this kindness, Ereshkigal granted them a boon. They asked for Inanna's corpse. Sprinkling it with the food and water of life, they revived her. But the laws of the underworld were absolute. No one could leave without providing a substitute to take their place. Inanna ascended, followed by a troop of relentless Gala demons, enforcers who would drag a replacement back to the Ker. They first went to Ninchuba, but Inanna, grateful for her loyalty, refused to give her servant up. They went to Inanna's sons, but she protected them. Then they arrived at the great temple at Yuruk, and there Inanna saw Dumuzid. Her husband was not mourning her death. He was dressed in fine clothes, sitting on her throne and celebrating. A cold fury seized Inanna. She looked at him with the eyes of death and said, "Take him." The demons seized Dumuzid. He fled, begging his sister Jeshtanana and the sun god Utu for help, but he was eventually captured and dragged down to the underworld. Yet the story does not end in permanent loss. Jeshtanana, whose name means vine of heaven, offered to share her brother's fate. A deal was struck. Dumuzid would spend half the year in the underworld, and Jeshtanana would take his place for the other half. This is the Sumerian explanation for the seasons. When Dumuzid is in the underworld, the land is in mourning, the heat is fierce, and vegetation withers. This is the scorching summer and autumn. When he returns and Jeshtanana descends, the land rejoices with the rains and new growth of winter and spring. Her presence as a vegetation deity ensures life continues even during his absence. This myth is breathtaking in its raw complexity. Inanna is both life-giver and vengeful judge. Her love is conditional, easily turned to wrath by perceived disrespect. Dumuzid is not a kidnapper like Hades, but a flawed husband whose complacency leads to his downfall. The cycle of separation and reunion is not a romantic tragedy, but a hard-bargained arrangement born from betrayal, family loyalty, and the non-negotiable laws of cosmic balance. For the Sumerians, watching the Euphrates flood and recede, seeing the barley die and be reborn, this was not metaphor, it was observable reality. The divine couple's relationship was the engine of their food supply. The love and war between Inanna and Dumuzid were not abstract concepts. They were the reason the community would eat or starve in the coming year. The Sumerian cycle of life and death found its echo in the world's oldest written story, etched on clay tablets in cuneiform. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not about gods but about men, and the friendship that became the first great love story in literature. Gilgamesh, king of the city of Yuruk, was 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a being of immense strength and restless energy. But his power had curdled into tyranny. He claimed the right to sleep with every bride on her wedding night, and he worked his people to exhaustion building mighty walls. The citizens cried out to the gods for relief. Their solution was not to strike Gilgamesh down, but to create his equal, a mirror to reflect his own nature back at him. From clay and spit, the goddess Araru fashioned Enkidu, a wild man covered in hair who lived among the animals, drinking from their watering holes and grazing on grass. He was nature's answer to Gilgamesh's oppressive civilization. To lure Enkidu into the human world, the gods sent a temple priestess named Shamhat. She did not capture him, she seduced him, sharing with him the arts of love and human companionship for 7 days. This act transformed him. The animals now fled from his new human scent. He was no longer a creature of the wild, but a man with an awakened mind. Hearing of the mighty wild man, Gilgamesh saw only a challenger. He prepared for a fight. When Enkidu learned of the king's cruel custom with new brides, his sense of justice was ignited. He strode into Uruk and blocked Gilgamesh's path at the wedding house. Their battle was monumental, shaking the very doorframes of the city. They fought with the fury of bulls, but neither could overpower the other. In that moment of perfect, exhausted stalemate, something miraculous happened. Gilgamesh looked at his equal, and instead of hatred, he felt recognition. He threw down his arms. Enkidu did the same. They clasped hands, and a bond was forged that was deeper than any romance, a fraternal love that would redefine both their souls. Gilgamesh was no longer a bored tyrant. He had a companion, a brother who spoke truth to him. Enkidu was no longer a wild beast. He was civilized by friendship, learning loyalty, honor, and purpose. Their love needed an outlet, a shared project to test its strength. So Gilgamesh proposed a quest to achieve immortal fame, to travel to the distant cedar forest and slay its guardian, the monstrous giant Humbaba. This was war not for territory or treasure, but for glory, a thing they would do together to cement their names in eternity. Enkidu, who knew the wilds, warned of the danger, but his loyalty to Gilgamesh overruled his caution. Their journey was an adventure of mutual support. They encouraged each other through terror, and facing Humbaba's terrifying aura, they fought as one being. With the help of the sun god Shamash, they triumphed, cutting off the monster's head. They returned to Uruk as supreme heroes, bathed in the adoration of the city. But they had overreached. In their pride, they also insulted the goddess Ishtar, rejecting her advances and mocking her. Divine wrath, once set in motion, demands a price. The gods convened and decreed that one of the two friends must die for their transgressions. They chose Enkidu, not Gilgamesh the instigator, but his beloved friend. There is a brutal logic here. The deepest wound is not to kill a man, but to take from him the one he loves most. Enkidu fell ill, cursed by the gods. For 12 days, Gilgamesh watched helplessly as his mighty friend wasted away, raging against the injustice. When Enkidu finally died, Gilgamesh's world shattered. He clung to the corpse, refusing to let it be buried, until a maggot fell from its nose. His grief was a howling tempest. He tore his clothes, covered himself in animal skins, and fled into the wilderness, consumed by a single, desperate question. If Enkidu could die, so could he. What was the point of glory if it ended in dust? His love for Enkidu, which had once driven him to heroic war, now propelled him on a more impossible quest, a war against death itself. He journeyed to the ends of the earth, crossing the waters of death to find Utnapishtim, the one mortal granted eternal life by the gods. He learned the story of the great flood and received a test: stay awake for 7 days. He failed instantly, falling into a week-long sleep. As a final consolation, Utnapishtim told him of a plant at the bottom of the sea that could restore youth. Gilgamesh retrieved it, but on his journey home, a serpent stole it while he bathed. He returned to Uruk empty-handed, sitting on the shore and weeping. He had lost everything twice over, yet in his final moments he looked up at the massive, enduring walls of his city, the walls he had built before he ever knew Enkidu. He realized that while man dies, what they build together in love and partnership endures. The epic ends not with a victory over mortality, but with a quiet, heartbreaking acceptance. The love between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is the axis on which the entire story turns. It civilizes a king and a wild man. It fuels glorious, warlike deeds. And its loss creates the first existential hero, a man staring into the abyss of his own finitude. The story tells us that the deepest wounds of war are not always physical, but the empty space left where a brother once stood. It frames their bond as the truest, most humanizing force, more defining than any battle, and more devastating in its absence than any monster. Gilgamesh's grief for his friend was a human storm, but the Romans crafted a myth where love itself became the ultimate trial for the human soul. The tale of Cupid and Psyche begins with a beauty so radiant it became a curse. Psyche, a mortal princess, was so astonishingly lovely that people began to abandon the altars of Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, to worship this human girl instead. This was not admiration, it was sacrilege, a direct threat to divine authority. Venus, consumed by a jealousy as green as the sea, commanded her son Cupid, the god of desire, to punish this upstart. Her orders were specific and cruel. Use your golden arrows to make Psyche fall desperately in love with the most vile, monstrous creature he could find. Cupid descended, invisible, bow in hand, to carry out his mother's vengeance. But as he gazed upon the sleeping Psyche, one of his own arrows nicked him, or perhaps he simply looked upon her soul and was lost. He fell in love with her instantly, a prisoner of his own power. He could not complete his mother's task. Instead, he orchestrated a different fate. Psyche's family, troubled by her strange destiny, consulted an oracle that declared she must be left on a mountain peak to wed a monstrous serpent. In despair, they obeyed, but instead of a monster, the gentle west wind, Zephyrus, lifted her and carried her to a hidden, enchanted valley. There, she found a palace of impossible splendor, with invisible servants who attended to her every need. When night fell, her husband came to her in the utter darkness. He was kind, passionate, and loving, but he laid down one absolute law: she must never attempt to see his face or learn his identity. Theirs was a marriage of voice and touch, a profound intimacy built on trust in the unseen. For a time, Psyche was content, surrounded by luxury and knightly devotion. Yet a deep loneliness crept in. She missed her family. Cupid, relenting, allowed her sisters to visit, carried by the west wind. When they saw her opulent life without a visible husband, their concern twisted into envy. They planted a seed of terrible doubt. "Your husband must be the monstrous serpent the oracle foretold," they whispered. "Why else would he hide in darkness? He is waiting to devour you." That night, armed with a lamp and a dagger, Psyche broke her vow. As her husband slept, she raised the light. The glow fell not on a monster, but on the most beautiful being she could conceive, the god of love himself, his golden wings folded softly in sleep. In her shock, a drop of hot oil fell from the lamp onto his shoulder. He awoke, saw the light and the dagger, and his heart broke. Without a word, he spread his wings and fled. The palace, the gardens, the invisible servants all vanished in an instant. Psyche was left alone in a barren field, holding the empty lamp. Her transgression was not malice, but a very human failure of faith, poisoned by the envy of those closest to her. She had traded a love felt in the dark for a truth seen in the light, and lost both. Desperate to win him back, Psyche went to the one person she knew could command Cupid, his mother, Venus. The goddess, triumphant in her jealousy, saw her chance for true punishment. She set before Psyche a series of 4 tasks, each designed to be impossible for a mortal. First, she dumped a huge pile of mixed grains, wheat, barley, millet, and poppy seeds, and ordered Psyche to sort them all by nightfall. As Psyche despaired, a troop of ants took pity on her and meticulously separated the grains. Next, Venus demanded she fetch golden wool from a flock of fierce, sun-grazing sheep. A reed by the riverbank whispered advice, telling her to gather the wool caught on thorns after the sheep had passed at dusk. For her third task, she had to collect a jar of freezing black water from the source of the river's Styx and Cocytus, high on an unscalable cliff. This time, Jupiter's eagle, remembering a debt to Cupid, swooped down and filled the jar for her. Finally, Venus delivered the cruelest task, a descent into the underworld. Psyche must take a box and ask Proserpina, queen of the dead, for a bit of her divine beauty to bring back. This was a suicide mission, but a talking tower gave her precise instructions. Carry 2 coins for the ferryman Charon, 2 cakes for the 3-headed dog Cerberus, and most importantly, do not open the box. Psyche followed the instructions to the letter, navigating the land of the dead, obtaining the beauty, and returning to the light. Yet, at the very threshold of success, her human curiosity surfaced again. Thinking she needed just a touch of this divine beauty to win back Cupid, she opened the box. Inside was not beauty, but a death-like sleep that overpowered her instantly. She lay as if dead, the box beside her. It was here that Cupid, his wing healed, found her. His love had grown through her suffering and perseverance. He flew to Olympus and pleaded his case before Jupiter himself. The king of the gods, amused and moved, made Psyche immortal with a sip of ambrosia and formally sanctioned their marriage, forcing a grudging Venus to accept her mortal rival as a daughter-in-law. This myth is a masterful allegory. Psyche's name means soul in Greek. Her journey is the soul's path toward divine love, marred by doubt, tempted by false counsel, and purified through seemingly impossible trials. Each helper, the ants, the reed, the eagle, the tower, represents the unexpected aid that comes when the soul persists in its quest. The story tells us that love between the mortal and the divine is not a gift but an achievement. It must be earned through courage, humility, and the hard-won wisdom that sometimes the deepest truths are those we must first believe in without seeing. Psyche's trials earned her a place among the gods, but the founding of Rome demanded a more brutal kind of alchemy. The city's origin myth begins not with a love story, but with an act of royal violence. A usurper king, fearing a prophecy that his nephews would overthrow him, ordered the infant twins Romulus and Remus to be drowned in the Tiber River. The waters, however, had other plans. The basket carrying the boys washed ashore where a she-wolf, a creature sacred to the war god Mars, found them. She nursed them, giving them the ferocious strength of the wild. Later, a shepherd raised them, and they grew into natural leaders. When they learned their true heritage, they overthrew the usurper and decided to build a new city of their own. But a bitter disagreement arose over where to place its walls. Romulus chose the Palatine Hill, Remus preferred the Aventine. To settle it, they agreed to watch for divine omens in the sky. Remus claimed to see 6 vultures first, a sign of favor, but Romulus later saw 12, a stronger omen. In the ensuing argument, as Romulus began to dig the sacred trench for his new city wall, Remus leaped over it in a final, mocking gesture. This was a fatal insult. To cross the sacred boundary was to profane the city's very soul before it was born. In a flash of rage, Romulus struck his brother down. The first blood spilled to found Rome was not an enemy's but a brother's. This was the original sin of the city, a foundation built on fratricide, establishing a pattern where conflict and ambition would always be woven into its identity. Romulus had his city, but it was a city of men, soldiers, and outcasts with no future. A city without women could not last a generation, so Romulus devised a plan that was both pragmatic and monstrous. He invited the neighboring Sabine people with their wives and daughters to a grand religious festival in Rome. As the games reached their peak, Romulus gave a prearranged signal. His Roman men rushed into the crowd and seized the young Sabine women, carrying them off to be their wives. The Sabine men, outraged and betrayed, fled, vowing vengeance. This was not a courtship, it was a mass abduction, an act of war disguised as hospitality. The captured women were trapped, hostages in a strange city, forced into marriages with the men who had stolen them. A deep and righteous fury built in the Sabine towns. They gathered their armies and marched on Rome. What followed was a brutal war, with battles so fierce they were later immortalized in Roman art. The tide turned when the Romans captured the Sabine citadel through the treachery of a young woman named Tarpeia, who opened the gates for gold bracelets and was crushed by the shields of the soldiers she betrayed, a grim lesson in greed. But the true resolution came not from battle, but from the women at the heart of the conflict. After years of war, the final showdown was about to begin on the battlefield between the Roman and Sabine forces. As the armies clashed, the Sabine women, who were now mothers to Roman children, could bear it no longer. They rushed onto the bloody field, their hair torn, their infants in their arms. They stood between the spears of their Roman husbands and the swords of their Sabine fathers and brothers. One of them, Hersilia, now Romulus's own wife, cried out to both sides. She asked the Sabines, "If you are here to reclaim us as daughters, why do you come armed to make us widows and orphans?" And she asked the Romans, "If you are fighting for us as wives, why do you seek to make us fatherless?" Their intervention was a force more powerful than any army. They presented a new, undeniable reality. They were no longer just Sabine daughters or Roman captives. They were the mothers of a new people, and the blood about to be spilled was the blood of their children's family. Shamed and moved, the warriors lowered their weapons. The two peoples did not just make peace, they merged. The Sabine king, Titus Tatius, agreed to rule jointly with Romulus, and the Sabines were granted full Roman citizenship. This violent beginning forged a single, stronger nation from two. The myth is horrifying and profound in equal measure. It suggests that the bedrock of one of history's greatest empires was a forced, traumatic union that only time and shared children could heal. The love that ended the war was not romantic passion, but the fierce, protective love of mothers for their families, a love that created a new kinship where none existed before. Rome's strength, the myth claims, came from this brutal fusion, proving that sometimes the most enduring bonds are born not from gentle agreement, but from the terrible, messy crucible of conflict and necessity. Rome's foundation was a brutal merger, but a Celtic myth presents a love triangle where escape seems possible, until magic and memory seal a tragic fate. In the rolling green hills of Ireland, the great warrior Fionn mac Cumhaill, leader of the legendary Fianna, was to marry Grain, a woman of fiery spirit and royal blood. At the wedding feast, however, Grain looked upon her aging, powerful fiancé and felt only a cold dread. Her eyes swept the hall and landed on Diarmuid or Duibin, one of Fionn's own warriors, a man renowned for a love spot on his forehead that made him irresistible to women. In that moment, Grain made a decision that would ignite a legendary pursuit. She did not merely ask Diarmuid to run away with her, she placed a jaze upon him. A jaze was not a simple request, it was a sacred, magical prohibition or compulsion, a bond of destiny that could not be broken without bringing terrible dishonor or doom. To refuse a jaze, especially one laid by a woman of her status, was unthinkable. So, bound by this enchantment of love and duty, Diarmuid agreed, though his heart was heavy with the knowledge he was betraying his chieftain and friend. That very night they fled into the wilds. What followed were years of a life lived on the knife's edge. Fionn's wrath was monumental. He mobilized the entire Fianna, the greatest band of warriors in the land, to hunt the lovers down. Diarmuid and Grain moved like ghosts through the forests and across the mountains, their love forged in constant peril. Diarmuid used all his warriors' skill to protect them, and Grain's cunning matched his strength. Their passion was real, born of shared danger and defiance, a flame that burned brightly because it was always one step ahead of the storm. They lived a life of intense, stolen freedom, a romance written in moments of respite between relentless pursuit. The magic of the land itself seemed to aid them, with Diarmuid's foster father, the god Ingus Og, occasionally shielding them. But a jaze is a double-edged sword. It compelled Diarmuid to flee, but it also wove an inescapable thread into his destiny. After many long years, through the weariness of an endless hunt and the diplomacy of others, a fragile peace was brokered. Fionn appeared to forgive them. Diarmuid and Grain, now with children of their own, were welcomed back, or so it seemed. The old warrior's smile, however, was a mask. The bitterness of betrayal had festered for a decade, curdling into a quiet, patient hatred. The end came during a boar hunt. Diarmuid was gored by a magical beast, a wound that was mortal. Yet there was a chance. Fionn possessed a rare power. He could heal any man by letting him drink water cupped in his own hands from a special well. Kneeling beside his dying rival, Fionn went to fetch the water. But as he returned, the memory of Grain's choice, of the humiliation and the years of longing, flooded back. His hands, which had never trembled in battle, shook with the weight of that old pain. The life-giving water trickled through his fingers into the dirt before it could reach Diarmuid's lips. He went a second time, compelled by the watching eyes of his men and the shreds of his own honor. And a second time, as he knelt, the image of the lover's flight overwhelmed him. The water seeped away once more. By the time his grandson brought a third drink, it was too late. Diarmuid was gone. Fionn did not strike the killing blow, but he allowed destiny to serve his vengeance, proving that some wounds, especially those of the heart, never truly heal. This myth strips romance down to its most perilous components. It is not about gods manipulating mortals, but about mortals entangled in their own magical and emotional binds. Diarmuid was a hero trapped between two Gisa, his duty to his leader and the compelling magic of a woman's desire. Grain's love was an act of supreme will that condemned the man she chose to a life of exile. And Fionn's love, twisted by time and pride into obsession, reveals how the heart can wield a cruelty more final than any sword. The story asks us where true honor lies. Is it in keeping a magical vow, in forgiving a betrayal, or in protecting the one you love, even from yourself? In the end, the green hills of Ireland remember not a glorious battle, but the quiet, devastating moment when a man let water and a life slip away. The bitter taste of a grudge held too long finds its echo in the thunderous halls of the Norse. Here, the divine landscape was not a single, unified family, but a world divided. Two distinct tribes of gods viewed each other with deep suspicion across a cosmic rift. On one side stood the Aesir, the gods of sovereignty, war, wisdom, and cosmic order, led by the one-eyed All-Father, Odin, and his thunder-wielding son, Thor. Their power was carved from ash and ice, built on poetry, prophecy, and the grim necessities of battle. On the other side were the Vanir, older gods of fertility, prosperity, magic, and the untamed forces of nature. They were represented by beings like Njörður, who calmed the sea and filled the nets, and his radiant children, the twin deities Freyja and Freya, who presided over love, beauty, peace, and abundant harvest. For a time, these tribes coexisted, but a deep cultural clash simmered beneath the surface. The Aesir saw the Vanir's magic as strange and effeminate. The Vanir likely saw the Aesir as rigid and warlike. The spark that ignited the first war in the world came in the form of a visitor, or perhaps a weapon. A mysterious entity known as Gullveig, whose name means power of gold, arrived among the Aesir. She was a being of immense, unsettling magic, obsessed with gold and possessed of a power that seemed to corrupt and bewitch. The Aesir, fearing her influence, tried to destroy her. They stabbed her with spears and burned her in the hall of Odin itself. Yet 3 times they burned her, and 3 times she was reborn from the ashes, more powerful and more terrifying each time. This was no mere execution. It was an act of profound desecration against a power they did not understand. In retaliation, the Vanir declared war. What followed was not a quick skirmish, but a long, brutal, and utterly futile conflict. The Aesir hurled their might, but the Vanir's older, earthier magic held firm. Spears shattered against enchantments, and the land itself seemed to turn against the warriors. Both sides realized they were perfectly matched, and that this war could only end in the mutual annihilation of all divinity. So they did something remarkably pragmatic for gods. They sued for peace. To seal their truce, they did not draw a line in the sand, they exchanged spit. all the gods gathered and spat into a vast vat. From that mingled saliva, a new being was formed, Kvasir, the wisest of all beings, a living symbol of their new unity. But the truce went further. They exchanged hostages not as prisoners but as pledges of good faith and integration. The Vanir sent their best to live among the Aesir, Njörður, the god of the sea's bounty, and his magnificent children, Freyja and Freya. In return, the Aesir sent Honir, a tall and handsome god, and the wise Mimir. This exchange was the true end of the war and the beginning of the Norse pantheon as we know it. Freyja, the Vanir goddess of love, sex, and magic, came to live in Asgard, bringing with her a form of sorcery so potent it was sought after even by Odin. Her brother Freya, the god of peace, fertility, and sunshine, brought the promise of good seasons and prosperity. Their father Njörður brought mastery over wind and coastal wealth. The warlike Aesir were now permanently joined with the fertile, peaceful Vanir. This myth explains the composition of the Norse gods, but its deeper meaning is a lesson in cosmic necessity. The world cannot function on war and order alone. It would become a frozen, sterile fortress. Nor can it thrive on fertility and peace alone. It would be a vulnerable, overgrown garden. The integration was a divine acknowledgement that for the cosmos to be whole, the spear and the plowshare, the war cry and the love song must exist under the same roof. The Aesir-Vanir War ended not with a victor, but with a marriage of opposites, a hard-won balance where love and war were no longer rival tribes but essential, intertwined threads in the same great tapestry of existence. The truce between the Aesir and Vanir brought a golden age to Asgard, but even in a world of balanced powers, a mother's love cannot foresee every shadow. In the heart of this divine society lived Balder, the god of light, joy, and purity. He was beloved by all, a being whose very presence seemed to soften the edges of the harsh Norse cosmos. Yet peace is often the prelude to a fall. Balder began to be haunted by dreams, dark and formless visions of his own end. These were not ordinary nightmares, but prophetic whispers from the well of fate itself. His mother, Frigg, queen of the Aesir and goddess of foresight, was stricken with a terror only a parent can know. She would not stand idle while fate circled her brightest sun. So she embarked on a quest of exhaustive, desperate love. She traveled through all the 9 worlds, from the roots of Yggdrasil to the highest branches. She spoke to every entity, every substance, every force she could conceive of. She asked fire and iron, stone and water, disease and poison, every beast and bird and creeping thing to swear an oath. She asked them to vow never to harm her son Balder, and one by one they all agreed, bound by the power of her plea. It was a monumental act of protection, a magical immunity woven from the fabric of creation itself. Believing her work complete, Frigg returned to Asgard. In her weariness, or perhaps in a moment of maternal dismissal, she had passed by a young mistletoe plant clinging to an oak. She considered it too young, too harmless, too insignificant to bother with. It was a tiny gap in an otherwise perfect net. With Balder now seemingly invulnerable, the gods turned their anxiety into a game. In the courtyard of Asgard, they gathered and took turns throwing objects at Balder. Spears, stones, and axes were hurled with all their might, only to turn aside or drop harmlessly at his feet. Balder stood laughing, a symbol of joyous, untouchable life, while the gods roared with relief and amusement. But one god did not laugh. Loki, the shape-shifting trickster, watched the scene with a simmering resentment. He saw not joy, but a flaw in the design. Disguised as an old woman, he went to visit Frigg in her hall. He asked her with false warmth about the great game and the oath she had secured. Frigg, proud and unsuspecting, confided that yes, everything had sworn an oath, all except the young mistletoe on the western oak, which she thought too weak to matter. Loki needed nothing more. He went straight to that oak, carved a sharp dart from the mistletoe's pale wood, and returned to the gathering. He found Hertha, Balder's own brother, standing apart. Hertha was blind, unable to join in the game, and likely feeling the sting of exclusion. Loki approached him with poisoned kindness. He praised Hertha's strength and said it was unfair he could not honor his brother. He placed the mistletoe dart in Hertha's hand, guided his aim, and told him to join the tribute, trusting Hertha through. The dart flew straight and true, piercing Balder's heart. The light of the god fell dead on the spot. The laughter in Asgard died instantly, replaced by a silence more terrible than any battle cry. This was not a death in combat, it was a murder crafted in a mother's blind spot, executed through a brother's innocent hand. Frigg's love, vast enough to bind all creation, had been undone by the one thing she deemed unworthy of consideration. Loki had weaponized that oversight, twisting familial trust into a mechanism of doom. The gods were paralyzed not by grief alone, but by the horrifying revelation that their order was fragile, that fate could be hijacked by malice hiding in the small, forgotten places. Balder's death was the first and most irrevocable sign that Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, was now inevitable. It was the untying of the first knot. The prophecy stated that after Balder's death, the world would slide into a winter of winters where kinship would shatter and all bonds would rot. The great final war would follow. In this myth, love's attempt to defy destiny does not cause the tragedy directly, but it creates the precise conditions for it, by making Balder invulnerable to everything but the one small exception. Frigg inadvertently painted a target on him for anyone who knew the secret. Her love did not fail because it was weak, but because it was not quite complete. And in a universe governed by prophecies of doom, that single, overlooked sprig of mistletoe was all it took to set the entire cosmos on its inescapable path toward the final battle. The story whispers a chilling lesson. Sometimes, the very measures we take to protect what we love most can reveal the exact point where it is most vulnerable. Balder's death revealed a fatal flaw in divine protection, but in the Greek world, the king of the gods himself was the source of endless, chaotic passion. Zeus's countless loves are less a celebration of romance and more a chronicle of cosmic power imbalance, where desire sparks creation, conflict, and relentless cycles of vengeance. His method was rarely courtship, it was transformation and taking. To approach the Spartan queen Leda, he became a majestic swan, an encounter that led to the birth of two sets of twins, including the incomparably beautiful Helen. That single moment of divine deception would, years later, ignite the Trojan War. To reach the Princess Danae locked in a bronze tower by her fearful father, Zeus transformed into a shower of gold pouring through a crack in the roof. From that union came the hero Perseus, slayer of Medusa. For the Phoenician princess Europa, he took the form of a gentle, beautiful bull, luring her to climb on his back before charging across the sea to a new continent that would bear her name, Europe. And in perhaps the most famous abduction, he became a great eagle to snatch the Trojan prince Ganymede, carrying him to Olympus to serve as cupbearer to the gods, an act that blended desire with a celestial job vacancy. On one level, these are etiological myths, stories crafted to explain the origins of heroes, city-states, and even landmasses. They connect mortal families to divine ancestry, granting legitimacy and a sense of destined greatness. But beneath that explanatory layer churns a darker, more turbulent reality. Each of Zeus's pursuits was a betrayal, a direct provocation aimed at his queen, Hera. Their marriage, the divine archetype for all others, was profoundly dysfunctional, a constant state of Cold War punctuated by explosive retaliations. Zeus would pursue and Hera would punish, but her wrath almost never fell directly on her all-powerful husband. Instead, she targeted the mortal women, their children, or the innocent communities around them. Leto, pregnant with Zeus's twins Apollo and Artemis, was hounded across the earth by Hera, who forbade any land from offering her refuge. Io, another of Zeus's lovers, was transformed into a white cow and tormented by a gadfly sent by Hera, forced to wander the world in agony. The hero Heracles, Zeus's son by the mortal Alcmene, faced a lifetime of horrific trials engineered by Hera's hatred, from the madness that made him kill his own family to the seemingly impossible 12 labors. In this endless cycle, Zeus's love acts as a catalyst for human suffering. His desire plants a seed of divine favor, but that seed grows in the toxic soil of Hera's jealousy, producing a harvest of monsters, labors, and exile. The myths present a stark picture. The highest authority in the universe is capricious, driven by appetite, and his domestic life is the engine for much of the misfortune that trickles down to the mortal realm. We are left to wonder, are these stories about the creative, life-giving force of the divine, or are they a profound critique of unchecked power and the collateral damage of celestial discord? The loves of Zeus are not gentle romances. They are seismic events that reshape landscapes, birth heroes, and draw the terrifying attention of a scorned goddess, forever intertwining the genesis of greatness with the specter of divine wrath. Zeus's passion scattered chaos, but the myths of the Amazons present a different kind of disruption, a world where the lines between battlefield and object of desire were drawn by women. These warrior queens were not victims of divine whims, but commanders in their own right, whose very existence challenged the heroic order. Their stories, often told through the lens of the men who fought them, reveal a haunting paradox where admiration and annihilation could exist in the same breath. Consider Penthesilea. In the bleak days after Hector's death, as the Trojans mourned and the Greeks pressed their advantage, a new force arrived at the Scaean gates. Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, led her band of horsewomen to fight for Troy. Her motivation was complex. Some say a desire for glory, others a penance for having accidentally killed a sister. She was a storm on the battlefield, a whirlwind of skill and ferocity that briefly rallied the Trojan lines and cut through the Greek ranks. Her path inevitably crossed with that of Achilles. In their duel, the greatest warrior of the age met his match in martial prowess, but not in destiny. Achilles drove his spear through her, and as she fell, her helmet was knocked away. In that moment, the myth tells us something shifted. As her life bled out onto the Trojan soil, Achilles looked upon her face and was struck not by triumph, but by a devastating love and regret for her beauty and valor. He had slain a worthy queen, only to see the woman beneath the armor. The story forces a terrible question. Did he love the warrior, or only the beautiful corpse she left behind? His grief was genuine, but it was posthumous, a sentiment that could only exist after her threat was neutralized. It is a love born entirely from violence, a chilling fusion of conquest and longing. The contrast is found in the tale of her sister, Hippolyta, and the 9th labor of Heracles. The hero's task was to retrieve her magical girdle, a symbol of her sovereignty as queen. In the earliest, most peaceful version of the myth, Heracles simply explains his quest. Hippolyta, impressed by his fame and perhaps feeling a kinship as another mighty figure, agrees to give him the girdle willingly. Here, the interaction is one of mutual respect, a diplomatic exchange between equals where no blood is shed. But that is not the story that took root. In the more common, darker version, the goddess Hera, ever seeking to destroy Heracles, stirs trouble. She spreads a rumor among the Amazons that the Greek hero and his crew have come to kidnap their queen. Trust broken, the warrior women arm themselves and attack the ship. A brutal battle erupts. In the chaos, Heracles, believing Hippolyta has betrayed him, kills her and takes the girdle by force. This version replaces a peaceful transaction with a tragic misunderstanding that escalates into a deadly conflict. The queen, who might have been an ally, becomes a casualty of divine manipulation and rushed violence. In both myths, the Amazon queen exists at a dangerous crossroads. She is a formidable opponent, a leader whose martial skill is undeniable. Yet, in the Greek heroic imagination, she is also inevitably framed as an object, whether of posthumous love or as the keeper of a prize. Her power makes her a target, and her femininity makes her death or subjugation a poignant twist in the hero's story. These are not tales of the Amazons for their own sake. They are tales of how the greatest Greek heroes interacted with them, and those interactions always end with the queen's power being transferred, surrendered, or extinguished. They explore that unsettling space where awe can turn to possession, where respect can be overshadowed by the urge to conquer, and where the most powerful women in myth are ultimately remembered for how they fell, and into whose arms or at whose hands they fell. The warrior queens fell, but some cities were born from a contest of divine gifts. In the early days of Attica, a magnificent settlement grew on a rocky hill, and it needed a name and a protector. Two powerful deities stepped forward, each with a deep love for the potential of this place and its people, but their affections were of a very different nature. Poseidon, the earth-shaking god of the sea, strode to the Acropolis and struck the bare rock with his mighty trident. The stone split, and from the crevice a spring burst forth. But the water that gushed out was as briny as the ocean, a symbol of naval power and dominion over the deep, yet utterly undrinkable. Some versions say he instead created the first horse, a creature of strength, speed, and warfare. Then came Athena, the gray-eyed goddess of wisdom and strategic craft. She knelt quietly and planted something in the same dry earth. What grew was the first olive tree, a gnarled and resilient thing. Its wood provided fuel and shelter. Its fruit provided rich oil for light, for cooking, for cleansing the body, and for anointing in sacred rites. It was a gift that promised not conquest, but sustained life, peace, and prosperity over generations. The choice fell to the city's king, Cecrops, and its citizens. They looked at the saltwater spring, impressive but ultimately barren for their daily survival. They looked at the horse, a tool for war. Then they looked at the olive tree, a source of nourishment, healing, and economic wealth. They chose Athena. The city was named Athens in her honor, and the sacred olive tree on the Acropolis stood for centuries as a testament to that fateful decision. This myth is profound because the object of divine love is not a person, but a collective, a civic body. Athena's love was practical and nurturing, focused on the long-term flourishing of civilization itself. Poseidon's love was tied to raw power and maritime dominance. The Athenians' choice defined their very identity, orienting them toward wisdom, the arts, and civic life. But divine rejection carries a long shadow. Poseidon's wrath was not a momentary fit, it became a permanent undercurrent in Athenian history. For a seafaring people, the god of the sea's displeasure was a terrifying prospect. Later myths and historians would often point to this ancient snub as the root cause of Athenian naval disasters, as if Poseidon's love, once spurned, could forever after manifest as a treacherous wave or a sudden storm against their ships. The city thrived under Athena's olive branch, yet it always sailed on the restless, unforgiving domain of the rival it had chosen against. The divine love that birthed nations could also fracture the very fabric of existence. In the quiet before time, according to Japan's ancient Shinto tradition, all that existed was a formless, oily sea. From the primordial heavens, two deities descended, the male Izanagi and the female Izanami. They stood upon the floating bridge of heaven, gazing down into the swirling chaos below. To bring order, they dipped a magnificent jeweled spear, Aim no Nuboko, into the brine and stirred. When they lifted it, the drops that fell from its tip coagulated and formed the first solid land, the island of Onogoro. The couple descended to this newborn earth, their home now a solitary speck in an endless ocean. Their first act was to establish a marriage ritual. They erected a central pillar, the August Pillar, and circled it in opposite directions. When they met, Izanami, the female, spoke first, saying, "What a fine young man." They united, but their first child was born malformed, a leech child they set adrift in a reed boat. Puzzled by this failure, they consulted the elder gods, who revealed the flaw in their ceremony. The male should have spoken the greeting first, so they returned to the pillar, circled again, and this time when they met, Izanagi spoke. "What a fine young woman," he said. Their union, now correctly ordered, was profoundly fertile. From their love, the rest of the Japanese archipelago was born, island by island, followed by a host of kami, deities of the mountains, rivers, winds, and trees. This was creation through harmonious partnership, a world built from loving collaboration. But creation carries inherent risk. In giving birth to the fire god Kagetsuchi, Izanami was terribly burned. Her wounds festered, and from her sickness and vomit more deities emerged, deities of metal and earth, born from her suffering. Finally, she died, departing to Yomi, the shadowy and polluted land of the dead. Izanagi's grief was a tempest. He raged, beheading the fire god whose birth caused the tragedy. And from the blood and body parts of that slain deity, even more gods sprang forth. But his anger could not fill the void. Driven by a love that refused to accept this new boundary, he resolved to do the unthinkable, to descend into Yomi and bring his wife back to the land of the living. He traveled to the entrance, a dark cavern, and called out to her. Izanami, from within the shadows, answered. She told him he had come too late. She had already eaten the food of Yomi, binding her to that realm. But she would plead with the gods of the dead for release. She begged him, however, not to look upon her while she negotiated. Izanagi agreed, waiting in the oppressive darkness. But as time stretched on, his patience frayed. Fear and longing overcame his promise. Breaking off a tooth from the comb in his hair, he lit it as a torch and entered the hall to seek her. The flickering light revealed Izanami, but not as he remembered. Her body was in an advanced state of decay, swarming with maggots, with thunder gods roaring in the rotting cavities of her flesh. The vision was one of absolute, visceral horror. Izanagi, shocked and revolted, turned and fled. Izanami, shamed and enraged by his betrayal of his promise and his rejection of her transformed state, gave chase. She sent the hags of Yomi after him, then the 8 thunder gods born from her corpse, and finally she herself pursued him. In a desperate race, Izanagi hurled his headdress, which became grapes to delay the hags. He threw his comb, which became bamboo shoots to slow the thunder gods. As Izanami drew terrifyingly close, he reached the entrance to Yomi. He seized a massive boulder and rolled it into place, sealing the passage shut forever. From opposite sides of the stone, they uttered the words that finalized their divorce. Izanami screamed that if he left her, she would strangle 1,000 of his living people each day. Izanagi shouted back that he would then cause 1,500 to be born every day. In this final exchange, love and grief crystallized into a permanent cosmic standoff. The myth explains the origin of death itself and the eternal, cyclical struggle between life and mortality. Izanagi's flight was not cowardice, but a primal, instinctive recoil from the pollution of death, a force now irrevocably separate from the purity of life. Their separation created the fundamental schism that defines our condition, the clean world of the living and the defiled realm of the dead, divided by a stone that was placed not by malice, but by a husband's horror and a wife's wrath. The first love created the world, but it was the rupture of that love that made our mortality absolute. The stone that sealed Izanagi from death speaks of a final separation, but some gods crossed that boundary not to flee but to resurrect. In the highlands of ancient Mexico, the plumed serpent Quetzalcoatl coiled through the myths of the Aztecs and their predecessors, a deity of breathtaking duality. He was the god of wind who brought the breath of life and the patron of wisdom who gave humanity the calendar, arts, and maze. Yet his story is woven through with both profound love and inevitable conflict, mirroring a world where creation demanded a terrible price. After a previous world age had been destroyed, the earth lay silent and empty. The gods gathered, knowing a new humanity was needed to honor and sustain them. But the bones of the old race lay scattered in the deepest realm of the underworld, Mictlan. Quetzalcoatl, driven by a creative love for the potential of life, volunteered for the perilous descent. He journeyed through the 9 treacherous layers of Mictlan, facing chilling winds and monstrous guardians to stand before Mictlantecutli, the skeletal lord of the dead. The Lord of the Dead agreed to give up the precious bones, but only if Quetzalcoatl could complete a seemingly simple task: to circle his realm 4 times while blowing a conch shell trumpet. The shell, however, had no holes. Undeterred, Quetzalcoatl summoned worms to bore into the shell and bees to fly inside and make it roar. The underworld echoed with its unexpected blast. Tricked, Mictlantecutli handed over the bones, yet as Quetzalcoatl fled upward, the Lord of the Dead sent quail to frighten him. The god stumbled and the bones scattered, some breaking. This is why the Aztecs said humans come in different sizes, but the broken bones were just raw material. Back in the world of the gods, Quetzalcoatl and his companions ground the bones into a fine flour-like powder. Then the crucial act of love occurred. The gods gathered to give life to this inert substance. Quetzalcoatl and several others performed auto-sacrifice, piercing their own genitalia to let their divine blood flow onto the bone meal. It was his blood, his vital essence, that animated the mixture, kneading it into the flesh of the first man and woman. Humanity was born not from dust, but from the bones of the dead and the self-inflicted, loving sacrifice of a god. This was a generative, nurturing love, a deity literally bleeding so that we might live. Yet this same god was locked in an eternal, destructive struggle. His opposite was Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, a god of night, sorcery, and violent conflict. Their rivalry shaped the cosmos. In one pivotal myth, Tezcatlipoca used his dark magic to exploit Quetzalcoatl's sense of honor and morality. He disguised himself and presented the plumed serpent with a mirror. When Quetzalcoatl looked in, he saw not his divine form, but a mortal man's face, lined and aged. For the first time, he saw himself as weak and finite. Then Tezcatlipoca offered him pulque, a strong fermented drink. Quetzalcoatl, intoxicated, broke his own priestly vows. In his shame, he set his city of Tolan aflame and went into exile, promising one day to return from the east. This exile was more than a personal defeat. It was the victory of chaotic, warlike forces over order and wisdom. It established a cyclical pattern where the gentle, civilizing love of Quetzalcoatl was perpetually challenged by the shadowy violence of his rival. This duality is the heart of the Aztec cosmic vision. Quetzalcoatl's loving act of creation required a journey into death and the spilling of his own blood. His wisdom was constantly at war with the forces of conflict and deceit. The Aztecs saw this tension played out in their own reality, in the necessity of the sun's daily war against darkness, and in the ritual bloodshed they believed was required to keep the cosmos, which began with a god's blood, from collapsing. Quetzalcoatl embodies the impossible balance, a god whose love gives life, but whose world is defined by the very conflict that seeks to undo it. Quetzalcoatl's blood gave life to humanity, but it also set a divine precedent where creation and conflict were locked in a cycle. That same pattern of a necessary, violent relationship echoes across the continents, in the deep forests of the Slavic world. Here, the sky itself wages a perpetual war against what lies beneath. This is the myth of Perun and Veles, a story where thunder is not just noise, but the sound of a god in pursuit. Perun, the mighty lord of thunder, lightning, and the clear sky, was the ultimate enforcer of cosmic order and justice. His opposite was Veles, a shape-shifting, serpentine god of the underworld, of cattle, magic, and the untamed, watery chaos of the earth. Their conflict was not a single event, but the fundamental rhythm of the world. And it often began with a theft that felt deeply personal. In many tellings, Veles, from his shadowy domain below, would slither up into the ordered world of the sky. He would steal what was most precious to Perun, sometimes his divine cattle, and in some of the most poignant versions, his wife or even his children. This was not a raid for treasure, it was a provocation that struck at the heart of the thunder god's domain, his family, and his honor. The response was immediate and cataclysmic. Perun would seize his axe or his mighty hammer and give chase. His pursuit was the storm itself. He would race across the heavens in his chariot, the rumble of its wheels becoming the thunder that shakes the mountains. He would hurl his lightning bolts, those brilliant forked spears of pure celestial fury, down at the fleeing veals. The serpent god, in terror, would dive for cover. He would hide beneath the roots of the world tree, transform into animals, or burrow under the largest stones he could find. The lightning would strike the ground, splitting trees and shattering rocks as Perun tried to flush his enemy out. This is why the Slavs believed you never take shelter under a tall, isolated tree during a storm, for that is precisely where veals might be hiding, drawing Perun's deadly aim. On the surface, this is a classic myth of order versus chaos, of the sky god defending his realm from the chthonic trickster, but look deeper and you see a startling interdependence. Perun's lightning, in its violent quest for veals, does not just destroy. When it strikes the earth, it brings with it the life-giving rain. That rain soaks into the ground, the very domain of veals, nourishing the crops, filling the rivers, and making the cattle fertile. The theft that sparked the war also initiates a necessary exchange. Veals, by stealing from the sky, draws down the fertilizing power of the storm. Perun, by attacking the earth, inadvertently nourishes it. Their hatred is a kind of brutal, cosmic collaboration. The thunderstorm is not a punishment, but a passionate, violent reunion of opposing forces that the world requires to be fertile and whole. The myth explains the natural cycle in the most dramatic terms possible. The dry, ordered sky must clash with the wet, chaotic earth for life to spring forth. There can be no growth without the tension between them. It frames the terrifying power of a lightning strike not as mindless destruction, but as part of a divine dialogue, a necessary violence that ensures the fields will be green and the herds will multiply. Perun and veals are forever locked in their chase, not because one can ever truly win, but because the world would end if they ever stopped. The thunderous chase of Perun and veals shows a world defined by elemental conflict, but across the Sahara, a different kind of epic was being woven, one where a hero's personal struggle becomes the foundation for an empire. The story of Sundiata Keita is history remembered as myth, a tale where love for a mother and a stolen homeland ignites a war that would echo for 1,000 years. Sundiata was born into the royal line of the Mandinka people, but his birth was shrouded in difficulty. For years he could not walk. He crawled on all fours, a source of deep shame for his mother, Sogolan, the buffalo woman, who was a second wife brought to the king because of a prophecy. Her very presence was born from a supernatural hunt, as the king's magicians had tracked a mystical buffalo that was terrorizing the land, only to find the creature's power resided in a humble, hunchbacked woman, Sogolan. She carried a magical legacy within her, a strength that would pass to her son. The young Sundiata endured ridicule from the king's first wife and her son, the heir apparent. Yet Sogolan's love was a fierce, protective force. She believed in the prophecies that spoke of her son's greatness, even as he dragged himself through the dust. The defining moment of his childhood came not from a battle, but from a mother's quiet desperation. Facing yet another humiliation, Sogolan went to her son, her voice thick with a sorrow only a parent who has watched their child suffer can know. She told him she needed a baobab leaf from a tree just outside their compound. It was a simple, impossible request for a boy who could not stand. Something in her plea, in the weight of her unspoken faith, ignited a power sleeping within him. Sundiata called for the iron rod that would become his legendary staff. With a surge of will that seemed to bend the very air, he pulled himself upright. The rod bent under his newfound strength, but he stood. He took one step, then another, and walked to the baobab tree. With his bare hands, he uprooted the entire tree and brought it to his mother. In that single act, the crippled boy was gone, and the Lion King was born. His strength was clearly supernatural, a sign of divine favor, and his mother's magical heritage made manifest. But political jealousy is a poison. After the king's death, Sundiata and Sogolon were forced into exile to escape the plots of the new ruler. Their years of wandering were a crucible, a time of hardship where the bond between mother and son was their only fortress. Sundiata's love for Sogolon and his burning memory of his rightful place became the twin fuels for his resolve. He learned the arts of war and diplomacy in foreign courts, gathering allies and a reputation that grew with every step away from home. Meanwhile, a true terror had arisen in the Mandinka homeland. The sorcerer King Saumayoro Kante of Soso had conquered the fractured kingdoms with a cruel, magical tyranny. His palace was a house of horrors, adorned with the skins of his defeated rivals. He possessed powerful juju, charms that made him nearly invulnerable in battle. His very presence spread fear like a desert wind. The exiled princes and oppressed peoples sent for Sundiata, the one prophesied to liberate them. His war of return was therefore framed as more than a political campaign. It was a cosmic correction, a righteous destiny clashing with dark sorcery. The final confrontation at the Battle of Karina was a clash of armies, but also a duel of mystical powers. Sundiata, advised by wise seers, learned that Saumayoro's magic had a single weakness, a talisman made from the spur of a white rooster. In the midst of the chaotic melee, Sundiata did not strike the sorcerer king with a mortal blow. Instead, he shot an arrow tipped with that special spur. The arrow did not kill Saumayoro, but it touched him, and in that touch it nullified his protective magic. Stripped of his invincibility, filled with terror for the first time, Saumayoro turned and fled the battlefield, vanishing into the mountains, never to be seen again. His army collapsed, victory was total. Sundiata's triumph was not just the reclaiming of a throne, it was the founding act of the Mali Empire, one of the largest and wealthiest realms in medieval history. The epic, passed down by generations of griots, the master poets and historians of West Africa, beautifully blends the tangible and the miraculous. Sundiata's love for his mother is the human heart of the story, the emotional engine that drives him from weakness to strength. The supernatural elements, the buffalo woman, the prophecies, the magical weakness elevate his struggle into a mythic template, a story about how divine favor aligns with personal virtue and filial devotion to correct a world gone wrong. This is not a myth of gods manipulating humans from afar, but of a human's love and destiny drawing the supernatural into his service, forging an empire from the raw materials of exile, memory, and a mother's unwavering faith. Sundiata's epic feels ancient, yet its core beats with a rhythm we still recognize today. The 25th myth is not etched in clay or sung by a bard, but projected onto screens and printed in panels all around us. It is the modern myth, the enduring power of these archetypes in contemporary culture. We have not outgrown the stories of divine love and war, we have simply given them new costumes and worlds to inhabit. Look at the pantheon of superheroes, our modern Olympus. Wonder Woman, Princess Diana of Themyscira, is literally an Amazon, a direct descendant of those warrior queens whose myths both fascinated and threatened the ancient Greeks. Her entire narrative is torn between her sacred duty as a champion and her profound love for humanity, embodied in her relationship with Steve Trevor. She is a goddess of war who chooses to fight for love, a perfect synthesis of the ancient tension. Similarly, the Marvel Universe constantly replays these divine dynamics. Thor is a Norse god stripped of his power and exiled to Earth, where he learns humility and love, much like the gods who walked among mortals in the old tales. His conflicts with Loki mirror the fraternal betrayals and chaotic rivalries of the Aesir. while his romance with Jane Foster echoes the mortal-immortal unions that always carried a cost. In epic fantasy, the template is even clearer. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings is a war story fundamentally shaped by love. The love of Arwen and Aragorn is a classic tale of an immortal being sacrificing her eternity for a mortal king, a choice that mirrors countless myths where love defies divine law. Their bond is the emotional anchor of the human struggle against darkness, but the love is not just romantic. The fierce, brotherly love between Frodo and Samwise Gamgee, a bond that carries the ring to the brink of doom, is the heart of the entire quest. It is the loyalty of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the devotion that makes the unbearable journey possible. The war against Sauron is not fought for territory, but for the preservation of everything gentle and good, the Shire, the bonds of fellowship, the songs and stories that define a people. It is a war ignited by a cosmic malice, but fought for reasons deeply, intimately human. Our films constantly return to these ancient wells, often directly. A movie like Troy attempts to strip the gods from the Iliad, presenting a gritty, human-scale conflict. Yet even there, the driving forces remain the same: the wrath of Achilles over his stolen honor and the loss of Patroclus, the consuming love between Paris and Helen that sparks the war. The gods may be absent, but their domain, the realm of overwhelming passion and fate, is still the true battlefield. We are still captivated because these stories are not really about gods and monsters. They are about us. They are the original templates, the foundational code for our own emotional and moral universe. The passion that can start a war and the bond that can end one are not archaic concepts. They are the forces that shape our daily headlines and our private hearts. We watch Thor wield his hammer not because we believe in Norse gods, but because we understand the struggle to be worthy of power. We are moved by Arwen's choice because we all know what it is to sacrifice for love. These myths endure because they speak in the grandest possible terms about the most fundamental human experiences, the loves that give us a reason to live and the conflicts that test what we are willing to die for. They remind us that our own stories, however small they seem, are still part of that ancient, endless conversation between the heart and the sword. From the cosmic to the personal, these 25 stories are more than just ancient entertainment. They are a mirror held up to humanity itself, reflecting our deepest fears, our most desperate hopes, and the messy, glorious entanglement of our hearts and our conflicts. We have traveled from the gardens of Olympus to the fields of Kurukshetra, from the silent halls of the underworld to the thunderous chase across Slavic skies. In every culture, the gods and heroes acted out a fundamental truth, that love and war are not opposites but two sides of the same coin, forever spinning in the hand of fate. They used love as a weapon to start wars, and they used war as a brutal, twisted form of courtship. Their passions shaped mountains, created seasons, and gave meaning to the rising and setting sun. Through their divine dramas, our ancestors explained why winter comes, why lightning strikes, and why our own hearts can feel both the urge to create and the compulsion to destroy in the very same moment. So as we close this journey, I leave you with two questions to ponder. First, which of these 25 myths resonated with you the most? Was it the patient weaving of Penelope, the devastating grief of Gilgamesh, or the cosmic balance of Shiva and Parvati? And second, do you think there is a fragment of historical truth hidden within any of these legends, a faded memory of a real king, a queen, or a cataclysmic event that was later wrapped in the grandeur of myth? The line between history and story is often the most fascinating mystery of all. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear which story stayed with you. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the mysteries of divine love and war, be sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you do not miss our next journey into the hidden corners of the past. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep questioning history.